Oh, very cool.
Welcome back to the Priority Wellness Podcast, and it's been a while. We are back with Pat O'Connell,
Hello.
and my name is Colin Hoyty. We both took a little bit of a hiatus from this podcast, but we're excited to be back.
Yeah, I blame you though, because you were in paramedic school and you ditched me. So,
oh, well, it's quite unfortunate, actually.
Yeah, shame on you for trying to further yourself and get educated.
But thank God I'm done. So, today on the podcast we have Daniel Sundahl from DanSun's Photos. It's really great to have you, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, you guys. Thanks for having me here. I'm really excited.
Glad to have you. So people in the first responding community might already be familiar with your work, Dan. I've seen your work for quite a few years. I just didn't know who was the artist behind it. I kind of thought maybe it was a few people that were kind of copying a style, but I've seen it for a long time. And now we get to talk to you, which is great. And maybe we can post something like when we post this on our social media, we can post some of your photos. That way people will recognize the artwork for sure. They will, I know. But,
yeah, sure.
As long as you're okay with that.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I love it. It's, I love doing these podcast interviews. I love talking about the artwork and mental health. And I'm always, I'm very sometimes surprised at how my peers and emergency services really connect to the artwork that I create, because the majority of it is very personal to me. And it's kind of how I express the experiences that I've had. And when my peers connect to it and see it, and they don't all accept it, that's for sure. But it means a lot to me. And I'm genuinely appreciated and a little bit humbled by it. But I think it's great.
We do too. And that's definitely something that we want to get into, is the art, because I think it's great work that you're doing. But Daniel, I almost called you Dan. Can you give us a little background of who you are? Maybe some of our listeners maybe don't know who you are, but maybe are familiar with the artwork. But can you just talk about like your background, where you started and where you are now, kind of thing?
Sure. So I'm from Canada. I live in Western Canada, close to the Rocky Mountains. I'm in Alberta. And I became an EMT in 1994, 1996, can't remember. And then I became an advanced care paramedic in 2002, 2003, I think. And then I accepted a full-time position as a career firefighter, advanced care paramedic in 2003. And I worked at the same department for 20 years. About maybe 8 or 9 years into my career, I developed PTSD. And that's when I started creating the artwork. So 2014, well, it's been 10 years already, is when I created the first images that I didn't share with anybody, because it was a way, with the help of my psychologist, to purge and process the experiences that I had as a paramedic firefighter. And he was right. So it was very cathartic. It was very helpful. It was a way for me to reprocess them and change where the memories are, so that I can recall the incidents without having a physical and emotional response to them. So it worked. But very personal to me. They're very authentic. It has to be authentic when I create them. Otherwise it's not therapeutic for me. And I continue to be very authentic in creating the artwork. If I'm trying to express, I have one that I'm going to be doing shortly, and I don't know if people are going to get it. It's just going to be really weird when people see it. But then I'll do a write-up about it. I'm like, look, this is what's been in my head for a while. I can't seem to get it out of my head. And it has to do with death, actually. So I think it's going to be pretty cool. If I can match the image I have in my head with what the concept is, I think it's going to be pretty cool. And I assume that maybe some people will connect to it. Anyways, that's how the artwork started. And all the images are staged. So I have the idea of what I want to recreate. I stage them with my peers or people that I work with, or now when I travel, and people that the crews that I meet when I travel. I photograph it, and then I digitally draw and paint on top of that photograph, trying to recreate the feeling of that event versus what people see. And I use angels and demons to represent trauma and recovery. And that's when you see those there, that's what they represent. And then that worked for me for a really long time. And then 22, I think. I mean, now that I think about it, this could be COVID related, I guess, is that my PTSD started coming back and my psychologist said, "Nah, you're done. You're not going to go back on the ambulance anymore." And I'm like, shit, what am I going to do now? So I went back to school and I just graduated as a counseling therapist. So now I'm a registered counseling therapist with the Canadian Professional Counselors Association. And I specialize in trauma and interpersonal relationship and couples issues secondary to trauma, and substance abuse and addiction secondary to trauma. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. And I still create the artwork, but the artwork has changed a little bit because now I'm all about the recovery and the benefits, actually post-traumatic growth, which is one of the big topics I'm going to be talking about when I come up and see you guys. So yeah, that's kind of my story.
Wow. Talk about full circle from somebody that probably needed a significant amount of mental health help to somebody that is that person. Wow. I would say people are probably very fortunate to have you as their therapist or counselor, because you understand.
Well, I think the 2 years I was in school, I spent those 2 years psychoanalyzing myself, right? So I'm learning the information,
Yeah.
and I'm like, oh, that's why I was like that. Oh, that's why my behaved that way. That's why I was suicidal, which I was, right? And I really learned that learned a lot about the neurobiology of trauma and what it did and how much it affected my capacity to really understand what was going on. And more importantly, now I know how to help people work through it, and we talk about in therapy, and we talk about a therapeutic alliance of the connection that the therapist has with the client. And, that is the most important aspect of a successful therapeutic, successful therapy is that connection you have with your therapist. So yes, I think I really do connect. I understand. But I also have to be very careful myself that I don't get too deep into it, that I have to be very careful of my bias and very careful of not getting my own experiences. Although I think it is very beneficial, that it doesn't become about me, right? It has to be about my client.
Right.
And sometimes that's a bit of a struggle for me.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few things I want to unpack. And I want to kind of go back to what you said earlier. So you were struggling with PTSD, and then your psychologist, did he suggest some form of creativity to kind of help through this PTSD?
Yes. So I was dabbling in photography anyways, and he knew that.
Yeah.
And I now understand why he asked me about my hobbies and what I wanted to do. He was wondering if there was a way that he could access the creative part of your brain. And he knew that I was doing pictures of my dogs and landscapes and that kind of stuff. So he thought of a way for me to process the traumatic experiences that I had while still utilizing that creative part of my brain at the same time. And right. At the risk of getting too geeky, there's a HPA axis, which is this automatic part in your lizard brain when trauma happens that just automatically sends the signals to your body to, okay, get ready to defend or run, or like the fight or flight response stuff.
Yeah.
And it happens automatically. But the problem is that if you drive past that scene, or you dream of that scene, or you recall it, or you have a flashback, your lizard brain doesn't know that it's not actually happening. So you have that physical response every time.
Right.
So if by me actively thinking of those events while doing the artwork, I'm able to interrupt that automatic process.
Okay.
Right? So it's like breathing. Like you breathe on your own. You don't have to think about it, but you can. No, you can't think about your breathing. So I would think about that. It's very emotional to do it. And when I'm done, like I said, I can recall that incident, but I remember it as the image that I created. It's like I trap that event into that two-dimensional picture. And then that's how I remember it. And then I can recall it as the artwork that I created versus this organic memory that just pops into my head whenever it wants to.
Right.
And I'm not, just happens. And then my HP access and the response, the fight or flight response just happens, kind of without me knowing about it. Like it's like I don't have control over it. And after doing the R work and accessing that creative part of my brain, that I'm able to change how that process happens.
Right. Right. And with PTSD is such a complex thing. As somebody that deals with PTSD myself, I know subsets of PTSD can be anxiety, depression, and maybe the anxiety can be more profound versus the depression, or you can have components of both. Did you, without getting too personal, but did you have the depression and the anxiety component there with the PTSD?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that's very common.
Yeah.
So anxiety and depression are very linked. So if I have a client that has anxiety, even when I was working on the ambulance, I don't work on car anymore, but even when I was working as a paramedic and I would have patients that were anxious, I would ask them if they had a history of depression. And the majority of the time it was.
Yep.
Or if there was depression, I would ask, hey, do you have a history of anxiety? And so they're very closely linked.
Yeah.
Now they're not always linked, but it's very common. And I think in trauma, for me, it certainly was. And I think for many people that are suffering from trauma or PTSD, I think if they have one, I would closely look or investigate to see if they had both.
Yeah. And I think where I'm leading here is, so with the depression, the anxiety component to the PTSD, how did you motivate yourself to even get into the creative process? Because I know for myself, and maybe there's others out there, that they are dealing with trauma, they are dealing with PTSD, and maybe they are talking to a psychologist, psychiatrist, a therapist, counselor, but they still struggle to get out of that funk and get into a creative space. It's hard to be motivated, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. How did you get that motivation to start doing the art?
Yeah, you're right. People do get into a funk. They get into that rut. And that's one of the horrible things, the insidious things of trauma, is that your neural pathways are so well grooved into your brain. It's hard to get out of that rut because it's so well traveled all the time. Every time you think about something, every time you re-traumatize, it's like the path of least resistance for your brain. So it's hard to, I think of it as a forest where if you have a fresh forest, the first time you make your way through the forest is kind of tough. But as you walk through that forest more and more and more, then a pathway forms. And then a wider pathway, then it gets paved. And then all of a sudden it's a 12-lane superhighway that, cars are going a million miles an hour. And that's what happens in trauma. So every time you think about it, every time you have it. So when you think of the trauma, then your memory or the idea that just goes down that superhighway and slams into your long-term memory stuff. But with therapy being creative, we're trying to build new pathways. So we're trying to create new pathways through that forest. So at first, it's really tough. It's tough to walk through that forest again. And it is. It's very emotional to create the artwork and to really think about the things, and while using my creative part of my brain at the same time, because I'm walking through that forest for the first time. But the more I do it, the easier that pathway gets. And the great thing about the neuroplasticity of your brain is that 12-lane superhighway, if you use that less, that forest will grow over. It's called pruning. So then you're growing new neural pathways through therapy, in my case, by being creative. And it gets easier as you go, because then those creative pathways, those healthier neural pathways, now turn into those 12-lane superhighways and then it's more effective. Like, it feels better, but it takes work to do that. So that's kind of what I did and what I encourage my clients to do. But yeah, it's a tough go at first. And there's a lot of other things that make it difficult to start. There's, identity issues with, people even identifying with their trauma. And it's the thought of recovery and the thought of doing something different is more scary than living with the symptoms of anxiety and depression, because that's what And if you've had it long enough, it's like, hey, it's familiar to me. So the thought of being a different way, sometimes that's even a deterrent that it's difficult to work with. And that's identity and attachment issues. And there's a lot going on there. But yeah, I'm not going to say it's easy, that's for sure. But
Right.
I think the secret is that you don't have to do it by yourself. You don't need to walk through that forest for the first time by yourself. Find someone. Like, of course, I'm going to promote mental health professionals that have experience in working with first responders and with trauma, that they can really help you build those new neural pathways and support you while you're doing it. And then eventually those old traumatic neural pathways will grow over like that forest. They'll prune over. And that's kind of how, and that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm big on post-traumatic growth, where by doing that work and you build new neural pathways, you're essentially building a new electrical network in your brain. And by doing that work, you can become better than you were before you were even traumatized, because you're basically revamping your brain. You're giving your brain an overhaul. But that's not easy. Like, you have to tough your way through that forest to build a better neural pathways. But I see it all the time. I see it all the time. I'm living proof of it. I see it all the time in our community of other first responders that are doing amazing things because of their traumatic experiences that they wouldn't be doing if they didn't.
Yep.
Right. And often I ask them, like, hey, if you can go back in time and not be traumatized, they'd be like, no, man, I am better now than I was before I was traumatized. And that's what post-traumatic growth is, which is what I'm going to really focus on when I come up and see you guys and do my presentation. I'm going to talk about that, get kind of deeper into that, and how we can achieve that. It's like a gold lining around the dark cloud of trauma.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like that, man, I can't wait. I can't wait for you to be up here.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm stealing the show here, Colin. I'm sorry.
So something that I wanted to ask is, when you're sitting down to do a new piece of artwork, whether it's planned or just something that you are doing off the cuff, kind of, when you're visiting all sorts of different places around the really the countries that you visit all over. What's your process like to unpack specific things that you want to tell with that piece of artwork?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, there's two different ways that I do it. So if I'm doing it for myself, like the one that's in my brain now, so I have this thought or this complex idea or emotion that I'm like, oh, okay, that's not going away. I need to get it out. And then, okay, how can I create what image is going to encapsulate this complex idea of what I want to portray? And I just think about it, and then an image pops in my head. I'm like, okay, that's the image. So the image is there. Then the trick is, how am I going to create this image? And the more accurate the actual image is to what is in my brain, that's a successful art piece for me. The more therapeutic it is for me, the more accurate it is to what I imagine that concept to be. So that's more when I create things personally, which is that one I'm going to do one about death. And that one's going to be, I have it in my head, and I have to find a couple people. I need to stage it and photograph it, and then digitally draw it over that photograph. But when I travel and I meet crews, which is great. So this just happened a couple of days ago. I was in Pennsylvania, and I was talking to some crews there, and it's great. I get to hang out with them and see their ambulances and see what the protocols are and look at their trucks and kind of talk about kind of the calls that they do in that area. And then usually they'll start talking about common calls that they do, right? I'm like, okay, can you remember the last time you did that call? And they're like, yeah. So I get them thinking about that call. And usually ones that they talk about are the ones that are stuck in their head the most. I'm like, how would you guys feel about staging that and me creating an art piece for you on it? And they're like, oh yeah, it's great. So essentially what I'm doing is they don't know it, but I'm doing a little bit of exposure therapy for them. So when we're in the back and we're setting it up, I get them to tell me about that call. Like, what treatments did you do? Like, what were the vitals? Where did you put the IV? What medications did you use? All under the guise of, okay, well, let's make this as accurate as possible, but it's still a fun photo session. So they are thinking about that call, but they're using their frontal cortex to answer my questions. And it's fun. It's in a fun atmosphere because it's a photo shoot, and I make sure it is fun, and everyone else is watching, so that it's something that most of us don't get to do, right, in that context. So it's actually therapy for them because they're building new neural pathways while recalling that image. And once we have it all set up, and I'm actually asking them to recall that scene, what it was. And sometimes it gets very emotional. And then I photograph it, and then I create the artwork from them. And I really try, if I am going to visit the cruise and then do a presentation the next few days, I finish that image and share it in my presentation. So then they see that call that they remembered in artwork. So then they will remember that call like I do as that art piece, right? And it's therapeutic for them. So I'm told that it's a way for them to change how they remember that call, because now they have a positive experience associated with that call and an art piece to remember it by. And I always give them that art piece. I'm like, hey, here's a digital file. You print it off and you can make barbecue aprons or mouse pads or whatever you want to do with it. Right. And then how my artwork is therapeutic for me then becomes therapeutic. And I love doing that stuff. Like that is great because it's always a really fun photo session, to do those things. And they love seeing it after, because I make sure everyone looks really cool in it. I can make sure everyone looks great in it. And then it looks like a cartoony DanSun's art piece, right? Which they usually really like. So yeah, I love doing that kind of work. I think it's really, 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 really fun. And I will have my camera up there. I'm going to bring my camera. So if you guys, hey, I'd love to do that when I'm up there. And I think I'm going to be there a day early. So I'd love to, if we can arrange that, just hang out with the crew there and do that. I think that'd be really fun.
I would love that, just because Colin and I were both photographers as well.
Mm-hmm.
Different niche, I would say, from you, but both photographers, so we both can relate to that aspect.
But that's how the process works. So it's very therapeutic, it's very cathartic. It's a way to get stuff out and have it so that you can remember. The goal is to recall that incident without having the emotional and physical response to it.
Yeah, it almost seems like a surrender of that past trauma, like you in a way relinquish it. Maybe not entirely, but I think how you do it in a creative way for others. I just thinking about some of the calls that I've been on, and if we were to depict that in maybe your art, or maybe I would feel that would be freeing in a way.
Mm-hmm. Because you're restaging it, so you're recreating it, which is exposure to that event.
Yeah.
But you know that this is just a photo shoot; it's not real. Yeah. Usually, people are really like the crew is there. We're chatting, it's fun because it's a photo shoot, and then we set it up. So yeah, it's I love doing it. It's really, really fun, and I think it's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like I guess the best way to describe it is like a relief for the people that you're doing this artwork for. Does that make sense?
I hope so. I hope that I can do it the same thing for them that it does for me. Or a lot of people will look at the artwork and attach their own experiences to it and get their own interpretation of it. And that alone will allow them to visualize that concept in this one two-dimensional picture.
Yep.
But often what they bring to it is very different than my motivation in creating it, which doesn't mean that their interpretation of it or what they bring to it is any less valid than mine. So I'll create an art piece based on my experience, and someone will look at it and attach their own experience to it. And they'll ask me, why did you create this picture? I'm like, well, I don't know if I want to tell you. You first tell me why you connect with this picture. And then I'll tell them my version, but I'm very careful. I'm like, just because I'm the artist that created it doesn't devalue or, your interpretation of it. And that's what our work is. It's what you bring to it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make it any less, less authentic or less credible because it's different than what my motivation was in creating it.
Right.
No, once it's out there, it's anybody's.
I mean, that's just beautiful within itself. I can remember looking at some of your artwork, probably 5-ish years ago. I didn't know who you were at the time. Sorry, but
Oh, that's okay. Most people don't know who I am. They know the artwork, but they don't know who I am.
I'm happy to have met you now in this sort of setting and to meet you next week as well. But to look at your artwork over the last 5 years or so, I just love how intense some of it is, how fun some of the other pieces are. It's all good stuff.
Yeah. It's I see your artwork everywhere. We're here in New York State, and even the state of New York, like our EMS state council, they use your artwork for some posters that would, mental health outreach and things like that. And again, didn't know who the artist was behind that, but the artwork is very relatable because you look at it and you're like, yeah, that looks familiar. I bet I know exactly how that person feels in that photo.
Yeah. No, I love it. I do quite a bit of stuff in New York, and I'm really happy that you guys asked me to come back. And I feel really, really blessed to be in an opportunity, in a position to come and do that and help my peers through my artwork, because it wasn't my intention at first. There's this saying that I really like in therapy, and it's pain plus the unwillingness to step into that pain is where the trauma is. So many people, and myself included, therapists, believe that the trauma itself isn't the issue. It's how we deal with it. It's how we perceive it, and it's what we do with it is the problem. So I love that saying, pain plus the unwillingness to step into that pain is where the trauma is. However, the pain plus the willingness to step into that pain is where the growth happens. So to be authentic and be willing to really face what's going on and to feel the feelings and to put that experience away is really where the growth happens. But unfortunately, what most of us do, we are toxic positivists, meaning that I'm fine. It's scary. And I know it's scary to step into those feelings because it's very emotional and it's pretty tough. But that's kind of how we have to put it. The opposite of being a tragic positivist is being a toxic positivist is being a tragic optimist. So if you face the tragedies or face the experiences with an optimistic attitude of it, it's like, okay, well, let's step into this, figure it out, let's feel it out, and then we put it away, then that is where the growth happens. And when we talk about post-traumatic growth, that's really what happens. It's the willingness to kind of really step into those feelings and feel them and then file them away in a healthier way so they don't interfere with your day-to-day living, which is where the D part of PTSD is. Right? Like a lot of people don't like using the disorder part. I agree, it's an injury, but I feel that it's the injury which is causing the disorder, which is defined as something that affects your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors on a day-to-day basis. So for me, my injury from trauma, my mental injury, was resulting in maladaptive behavior that was affecting my emotions and my thought patterns and my behaviors on a day-to-day basis. So by that definition, I had a disorder because of the injury. So I think both can be, but a lot of people are like, oh, the D is horrible, I shouldn't use the D. But for me, I'm like, well, let's just say what it is.
Yeah, I would agree without a question that it most certainly starts injury and then disorder for sure. Because
it could be both, but people are like, well, it's an injury, not a disorder. I'm like, well, you can have a disorder resulting from that injury, and it doesn't mean that it's permanent.
Right.
I don't know. I don't also believe that, well, once you have PTSD, you have it forever. That's not true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I had it, and I now do not meet the criteria for the DSM-5 for having PTSD. I have effects still, but not enough to meet the criteria. So sometimes I still wake up and I'm depressed or I have flashbacks from certain things, but it's not affecting my day-to-day living. Because when that happens, now I know what to do about it. I have healthy coping mechanisms and I know how to deal with it. So I don't meet the criteria for PTSD anymore, which is great.
That is great. That is very great. So, man, you are, whether you would label yourself this or not, but you are quite the humanitarian because, I mean, you're a first responder, you're a counselor, you do public speaking. Not to shift gears entirely, but we talked quite a bit about the artwork. What brought you into the first responder world? Because you were firefighter, paramedic. What was the drive there?
Yeah, that's an interesting story too. I was living in the Cayman Islands at the time, learning to become a dive master. And part of the dive master program is you learn to be a rescue diver. And that's when I first learned about CPR, about artificial respirations, about rescue efforts. That's the first time I learned any of that stuff. And I loved it. I'm like, oh, this is really cool. And as I was driving home, I saw this guy get smacked by this dump truck. And I got so excited. I'm like, oh, I'm going to go and I'm going to save this guy. Jump out of my car, run up to this guy, and he's like folded in half. And his foot is like up by his face. And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? Like, I had no idea what to do. Like, how do I do CPR? This guy's folded in half. Like, how do I can't even reach his face. Like, where is this? I didn't know, but I was so excited that I really felt this urge or this power. I really wanted to go and help this guy. Mm-hmm. And while other people were running away.
Right.
And it's when that same morning, we were just learning CPR that morning. I'm like, oh, okay, great. It's fresh in my mind. But I didn't know what to do. I had no idea what to do. I didn't want to move him. And then the paramedic showed up, unfolded him, and put him in the back of the ambulance and took him to the hospital. That's when I kind of thought that, yeah, maybe being a paramedic is really kind of what I want to do. And at the time, the reason I was living in the Cayman Islands in the first place is because I wanted to live like a full meaningful life. And that idea came into my brain pretty early in my life. Even, as a child, I'm like, yeah, I want to live a full life. So in high school, I traveled a lot. I've lived in lots of different countries because I really wanted to, to have a fulfilling life. Yeah. And I thought, well, being a paramedic, being a first responder, hey man, that's a fulfilling life. You're really going to see what things are like. You're really going to live on the edge.
Yep.
And it didn't disappoint. That's for sure. So that's kind of when I first had the idea of, yeah, maybe I should be a first responder. And then when I was done in the Cayman Islands, I went back home and then went back to school and got my EMR at this time, then EMT, then paramedic.
Wow.
That's how it started.
So I guess what would be your overall message then to the first responder community? It doesn't really matter the country because we all deal with the same things, the same types of calls, the same traumas, the PTSD. What would be your message to all the first responders out there?
I think it would be, especially for those that are maybe suffering a bit from the trauma, is to try to remember why you wanted to become a first responder in the first place. Try to remember your why, which is really linked to value and purpose, because sometimes we forget that when trauma enters into the brain. Right. So remind yourself of your purpose and why, because it's the best job in the world and the most rewarding and fulfilling job in the world. But there's some risk factors to it because of that. So try to remember why you have the job in the first place, or why you wanted to become a paramedic or firefighter, or police officer, or dispatcher, or corrections, or lots of whatever the public safety personnel job is. And then also that you're not alone and you don't have to deal with this stuff alone. Because I think with the archetype of being a first responder is we're fixers and we're helpers. So I think for us more than other people, the thought of asking for help is a little bit more foreign to us in general, right? Because we're like, well, no, we're the helpers. We don't need help. We help people. We're the one that people call if they need help. It's weird for me to ask for help, but you're not going to, if you bust your leg, you're not going to try to walk that off. You need to find a professional that knows how to fix broken legs, right? When you break your mind and it's not getting better, well, then find a professional that knows how to fix your broken mind, and then you can go back to work, right? So you don't have to do it by yourself. And I really like that there's so much more emphasis and a lot more awareness on mental health and the effects of it. But it's positive, right? So be aware of it, figure out what your mental health jump kit is before you need it. Just like your advanced airway kit on the ambulance, you're not going to build that as you need it. You get someone who's dying from anaphylaxis or having a status asthmaticus. That's not the time to build your advanced airway kit. Like, you're all prepared for it. So find your therapist before you need them. Start interviewing therapists and ask, do you have experience working with first responders? Why do you want to become a therapist? Do it while you have the cognitive ability, and do it like an interview. And most therapists will give a free 15-minute phone call or something. And if someone called me up and said, "Hey, Dan, I'm fine right now. I'm a paramedic, but I'm want to find my therapist so that if I do need something, I want to have that beforehand. So I'm conducting interviews. Why should you be my therapist?" If somebody called me up and said that, I'm like, "Oh my God, I need to be your therapist." Right? I would be like, man, the fact that you're being so proactive about it shows that, yeah, if you're proactive about your mental health that way, that is a super positive sign. I'm like, man, I have to be your therapist if you say that, if someone called me up and did that. So I would say for people, figure out what that is. Find out know the people that are close to you, that you trust, that you can call if shit hits the fan. Like, who do you trust? And maybe form an alliance with them, saying like, "Hey, can you have my back and I'll have your back too?" So that, we can call each other on our shit. If you start noticing changes in my behavior, then call me on it. And we'll make that agreement and we'll do it back and forth. So know who your therapist, know who the people are that you trust, and talk to them about it beforehand. Recognize what your stressors are, develop your coping mechanisms. Like, what are your coping mechanisms? Like, what makes you feel better if you had a bad shift? And then let your mental health partner know that. Like, let them know. So if you have that one event, and it doesn't always happen that way. So if you have that one call, and then you're now cognitively impaired because of that one call, you're like, man, I don't even know how to get home. Like, I'm messed up from that. Like, things are different. You call either your therapist, or you call your mental health buddy. So I'm like, "Hey, I had a call today, really kind of messed me up." And then that person knows, okay, I know what your coping mechanisms are. I know who your therapist is. I know, like, I can help you out, right? I got your back, and vice versa. So I think to be proactive that way is super helpful. And I'll talk about all the stuff up there.
That is really great advice, honestly.
Yeah. And then to know, like, safety factors. And so there's a lot of preventative things that we can do to mitigate the effects of the traumatic things that we see and experience.
I think the biggest struggle is the stigma that surrounds it. But
that's exactly why we started Priority Wellness Campaign, is to end the stigma, to let first responders know that it's okay not to be okay.
Yeah. But it's also okay to be okay. Right. So sometimes, like, I'll go to places like, "Dan, I've been a paramedic for like 30 years and I feel totally fine. Like, what's wrong with me? Like, I feel like I should be messed up with all the awareness that's going on." I'm like, "No, man, that's great. Like, if you've been great, then that's fantastic." And that's a lot with, now we're kind of getting into core values and stuff. And, core values can determine how susceptible you are to trauma and recovery and resiliency. And we're going to talk about that too, which I'm really excited about. But, of course it's okay to be not okay. And I love what you guys are doing, because you're normalizing it, which is really what's important, is so that people feel more comfortable coming forward, because there's so much more awareness. It normalizes the effects of trauma on your mental status, right? So that's okay, right? If more people are talking about it, I have no problem going to places and shaking the tree. And my presentation is very authentic. I get right into the weeds of it. I talk about depression, anxiety, suicide. I get kind of deep into the mindset of suicide, but how to recover and how to get out of that as well. So and that's just normal stuff, right? That's just what happens. Let's just normalize it. In Australia, it's like, I think in Australia, they're quite a bit ahead of us, where it's like, it's ingrained into the places that I've seen, or the places that I've visited. It's really normalized there, right? Like, physical injury, mental injury, same. Like, it's okay. Let's talk about the physical injury, let's be safe. You got to be careful. You can use this equipment. Okay. Mental injury, you got to be careful. You got to be safe. So it's ingrained in their day-to-day operations, and they talk about it all the time, just as they do with physical injury. So, and I think that's happening with more organizations like yours and all the other mental health advocates that are out there. It's getting better. Still got a long ways to go, but I think normalizing it really helps.
Still lots of work to do.
Yeah.
Daniel, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, my pleasure. I love it.
Great talking to you, and we look forward to seeing you. So when this releases, it will be a week from that day. So it releases this Friday. So November 9th. Yeah. November 9th, we're going to be in Watertown, New York at Jefferson Community College in the Stewart's Theater with Daniel giving his presentation. And we look forward to him.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited. I'm going to talk about post-traumatic growth. I'm going to talk about core values. I'm going to talk about stressors, controllable and non-controllable stressors, and what you can do about the non-controllable stressors. It's going to be, I'm hoping that people attend, they're going to leave with some really practical skills that they can, and tools that they can leave to help manage the stresses in their life a bit more effectively. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I am too. Like Colin said, it was a real pleasure to meet you, especially because I've seen your artwork for so many years. It's finally nice to talk with the person behind the art. So thank you again for being on today.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's a lot of fun.
Carving out some time in your busy schedule.
No, I'm good. I always make time for this. I love it.
Appreciate that. Anything else that you want to add before we kind of wrap up?
No, I think that was good. That was like 43 minutes. Like once I starting about this stuff, I can't believe in Colin, you're saying that we're almost, I'm like, what are you talking about? I looked at my clock. I'm like, oh, it's 45 minutes we've been talking. Yeah. So yeah, I know it's, I think we covered a lot of good stuff.
I do too. I feel like I could talk to you all day about this kind of stuff.
Well, I can talk about this stuff all day. I love it.
Oh man. Yeah.
Well, to our listeners, we'll see you next time.
Okay. Yeah, we're still recording. Okay, I thought we cut off, but yeah,
that's all right. That's all right. We're gonna throw all this in it too. So
no, I love it. That's great. Just keep it real.
Keep it organic. Yeah.
Yeah, keep it real.